Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's show. Before we get started on the topic proper, I am going to throw up for us a short clip that's going to be informative, I think. Yep. Uh, and I'll throw it up on screen here for Hetman to watch, and here we go.
It was also a practical necessity.
Well, you Yankees are just uncultured and basically miserable. That's the main difference between us. As our glorious president Jefferson Davis once said in a speech at the Mississippi State Capitol,
"Our enemies are a traditionalist and a homeless race. From the time of Cromwell to the present moment, they have been disturbers of the peace of the world. Gathered together by Cromwell from the bogs and fens of the north of Ireland and of England, they commenced by disturbing the peace of their own country. They disturbed Holland, to which they fled, and they disturbed England upon their return. They persecuted Catholics in England, and they hung Quakers and witches in America."
and clearly, the apple does not fall far from the tree. Oh,
Oh! Thou art an unlearned swine if thou dost truly believe that papists, Quakers, and witches ought to be shown mercy.
but religious freedom is one of the founding principles.
The devil's tongue wags in thy mouth. Those who love the Lord must needs separate themselves entirely from the professors of heathen faiths.
You know, that's not a bad point. Mixed communities are a disaster. Usually it's just one community getting to the top anyway. Communities are better kept separate, or at least totally homogeneous.
Oh, 'tis so.
That way they can preserve their race, identity, and culture. If you ever noticed, mixed communities look just like New York City and have no identity. Bastardizing anything unique.
Devilry! My God. I have returned, Lord. You have brought me to the Valley of Izion, where I live in the depths but see in the ice, ending by mountains of sin, I behold your glory. You have no power here, which find the children. I will draw thee out, Satan, as poison is drawn from a wand.
If I go, Johnny Rip dies.
Thou hast not killed me. Thou shalt not kill him.
The south is mine. Revenge!
My work here is done. Okay,
All right. So I think you can figure out why that has become no more stream. Goodbye stream. Stop streaming. Why that was the introduction for this evening's talk. We are talking tonight about Neo-Confederates and Wehraboos and Vatniks and how they seem to coincide into one particular intersection. They all seem to flow together. You okay there, Hetman?
Not only am I okay, you just remind me actually of a particular scholar. Actually, he can't be called a scholar, but someone that I know in Ukraine, and he is also the head of a Ukrainian. He's a neo-Nazi, or at the very worst neo-Nazi, at best a horrible revisionist, who denies Nazi crimes against his own people. Not to mention others. But he heads a Ukrainian Neo-Confederate group.
See, that's what I'm saying.
They exist.
Good
And you
evening,
know
Alice
what's
Payne. Welcome.
interesting too is that their whole war. Now he's a Ukrainian soldier. He's actually fighting in Donbass, and doesn't he see the parallels?
Probably not. Uh, it's so I have spent the last.
He thinks he's literally fighting against the forces that he loves. You can even look at the flag of the DNR and LNR, and you can see sort of a southern, like the same pattern of Southern Cross. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, there's so many parallels there. But yeah, these are the type of people that you encounter online. You encounter them when you are, go to any sort of hobbyist strategy game, shop. Um, they exist. Wehraboos, you know, I think it starts off as sort of a harmless love for, you know, German technology, which itself, you know, even even some of their things being, yeah, even some of their weapons being very effective were still so intricately made that they would break down frequently. And towards the end of the war, there wasn't the parts to fix them. Whereas, allies had the type of technology that was, mass produced, but it was, very easy to fix, very few moving parts.
Well, it's particularly interesting to me because I've spent a couple weeks now, sort of trying to build our presence on Twitter a bit. And that's an uphill climb, by the way, in the age of Elon Musk. If you haven't paid him $8 a month, I don't recommend it. Anyway, I have noticed a particular intersection of people who support the Confederacy, who support Germany, uh, or the Wehrmacht rather, and who seem to support Russia in their current war in Ukraine. And these are not pleasant people, I would say. But
So wait, are you mentioning, say, like a trifecta of
yes,
idiocy?
an unholy trinity of
It's usually, honestly, coming from a lot of Ukrainians who don't know any better and who are proud Ukrainians, a lot of them who are serving in the armed forces now, who have a soft spot for the Wehrmacht. And they causes these like rups, these like fissures in
the
place and
problem is that
everything.
Comcast is horrifyingly bad at providing internet service. There is good news on
I
that
got
front. Excellent news on that
AT&T
front.
fiber.
Uh,
Yeah,
Fiber will be here sometime in the next few months. We'll be switching over
perfect.
immediately.
We both will have fiber. That's very good.
Yes. All right.
Anyway, to go back to
Continue.
where I was at, so you do have this trend of Wehrmacht sympathy among certain amateur Ukrainian historians because of the fact that you have the very worst of Soviet state policy happen there. And then at the same time, a lot of these same Ukrainians um, remember, like, what their grandparents might have told them. Not everybody's grandparents suffered under the Germans. If you were living in a small village in the middle of nowhere, you didn't always see them. In fact, you would be very lucky or very unfortunate to see them, because usually that meant there were partisans in your area and they were there to just destroy the village. But yeah, a lot of Ukrainians, their experience with the Wehrmacht in these smaller areas um, was them passing through, and that was varied. You had some Wehrmacht soldiers that would steal from them, shoot them, rape the women, um, and then others that would give the children candy and just there's cases even that I know of where German soldiers quartered in someone's house and paid them for allowing them to quarter there for the night. And this is something that the Soviets, when they came back, their own army didn't do. And they actually stole too. So there is, it's not, I wouldn't say it's a very large sympathetic, Wehrmacht sympathetic population, but you have it there. So this idea to me of the trifecta of idiocy, where you have the Russian, like, people who are pro Wehrmacht, pro Confederacy, and now pro Russian. That's very new to me. Russia tends, at least, and from what I know, the sort of the Soviet cult, or the neo-Soviet cult, is stronger there. So you do have more people that, at least at this point in time, it wasn't always the case for Ukraine. And I think there's still a lot of these people in Ukraine, because the vast majority of Ukrainians, they fought in the Soviet army. And the Soviet army as an institution, there's very few good things you can say about it in World War II. They did a lot of they committed a lot of horrible atrocities and crimes. The only real noble thing they did was defeat the Nazis, which would have been worse. It would have been worse for any of the Slavic peoples where they were at, particularly, not all of them, but particularly for the Poles, for the Belarusians, for the Ukrainians. This would have meant their extinction eventually. It would have meant their cultural extinction. It would have meant their physical extermination. So, Russia understands, not all Russians, but I think that's more widely understood in Russia. It's very unfortunate because they've done a lot to trash any sort of decent reputation that the Red Army has, or decent sort of legacy,
Yeah.
just with their use of the symbols. And that's what really makes me sad, is because some of my favorite monuments, and it's not even because, I'm there to honor them, that I'm like, pro-Soviet, but some of my favorite monuments that I would go by when I visit Ukraine are like the T-34 tanks, the memorials that you'd see. And for me, knowing what I know about some of the localities that I travel and have roots in, I know what the Wehrmacht did there. I know the names of some of the people who committed crimes. I know the names of the victims who died. So, and I also know one fact, which, it's interesting. I have a colleague who, both of us, really, it's mainly her work, but she saved probably about 1,000 files from the archive that was destroyed in Chernihiv in Ukraine. And doing that was an absolutely invaluable service. Her and I have done a lot of extensive work. She has a tendency to be a bit more nationalistic, but after being under Russian occupation and experiencing that nightmare for a month, and basically having to scrap together food to beg for it, because they couldn't get back to anywhere around it, so they were in the area that was occupied by Russian troops. Luckily, she didn't witness any atrocities or anyone killed.
All right.
She
All right.
actually didn't
I'm gonna have to
have
zero you in on the point for this one.
no problem. Okay.
Yeah.
But
We're moving quickly away from our topic of discussion.
okay.
Uh,
Um, yeah, I tend to go on tangents sometimes. Can I just end it real quick
yes.
with one
Quickly.
thing? The majority of Ukrainians in left bank Ukraine, when the Soviets initially came back, and I'm going to have people who are going to detract from me with this, they came and greeted them for pushing the Nazis out. They weren't liberated, but they for that rescue. And a lot of them, of course, had their sons and daughters fighting in there. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Me and her debate about that. Lena, if she's watching, she can criticize me. Anyway, okay, let's get into the topic of Neo-Confederates. And why don't I ask you some questions, because this is something I don't really know.
Okay. Go for it.
Okay, so what are the origins of the Lost Cause myth? And has with the sort of political situation, the political dichotomy that you have in the United States today, especially when you have the far left, the woke left, and then of course the far right or
I'm going to put a
Trumpists.
moratorium on using the word woke in anything but an ironic sense on this channel.
Okay, we can put that moratorium, but let me
The far, you want to talk
yeah,
about the
but
dichotomy between the
you get
far
what
left and the far right.
yeah. Has
So,
this given rise over the last since 2016 to a growing sentiment, positive sentiment towards the Confederacy? It seems when you want to destroy monuments, it makes certain people start to think in the wrong way. I'm not trying to debate, should they be removed or not. To me, they should, I guess, but it's still not something that I'm very versed in. So, what are the origins of the Lost Cause myth, and has this Neo-Confederate movement um, grown in the last few years?
So the Lost Cause is kind of the result of a number of efforts that began very quickly after the end of the Civil War, um, and that try to rehabilitate the whole entire project of the Confederacy. The, the the simple truth of the fact is that the Confederacy, in every single case of every state that's went ceded over slavery, over the ability to keep that institution going. Uh, For slaveholders themselves, it's an economic imperative. They need to hold on to slaves because that's how they keep their wealth, and that's a fairly substantial expression of wealth for them. For everyone else, it is a racial imperative. Um, so not everyone necessarily in the Confederacy is on board with the cause, and there are significant uprisings uh, during the Civil War. But for the most part, the people who are involved in this, they talk about concepts like they're going to war to prevent what they called servile insurrection. So they saw the prospect of losing slavery and being placed on the same footing as the enslaved individuals as dangerous and problematic. Uh, they thought it would destroy their way of life. So they have several big problems now that the Civil War has ended and they've lost. The first is they've just lost a war. Um, the second is that war resulted in their absolute worst fear that
Yeah.
the practice of enslavement was ended. And the third is that now there's a very large population that they have placed there that has the ability to politically displace them. And that happens almost immediately. Elections are held in the South as they bring the states back in, and local elections and even Congress. You see a lot of previously enslaved individuals now becoming office holders, becoming justices of the peace and congressmen, and all of these things happen almost immediately. So you see the first and most immediate reaction is the formation of the Ku Klux Klan.
That's
Uh,
what I was just gonna add.
and the
That's a reaction to
Yes, so the Ku Klux Klan goes around and terrorizes. Um, the Ku Klux Klan goes around and terrorizes uh, African Americans who have taken offices, who have
yeah,
dared to place themselves on the same level as whites. And this is headed up under a former Confederate general, Nathan Bedford Forrest, um,
yeah,
who is another one of those people who is widely regarded as a
a brilliant
hero of the
tactic.
Confederacy. He is a very he's a very flashy cavalry commander. He's also guilty of a couple of atrocities.
Yeah, I was just gonna mention that. I don't know where it was, but I know that he was responsible for the massacre of like something like 300 captured, formerly enslaved Union soldiers.
Yes, colored
Yeah.
soldiers. Yes, Elfion is a Vatnik is like a tanky, but for Russian propaganda. And I absolutely think that there is a consistent thread of ethno-supremacist sentiments within these three groups. Um, the second set of options that start coming is you see a whole lot of Confederates who, through the process of Reconstruction, didn't really see any tangible consequences to their actions. So they just got to keep on going about their life, and there was an upending of station through the loss of uh, the loss of property in enslaved individuals, but there wasn't really a loss of station socially. Like everyone was all of a sudden laid low by the loss of uh, the enslaved individuals. And so they turn around and they start welding together these ideas that they went to war over this concept of Southern independence. And it's kind of an easy weld because uh, there's no real pushback at first. And so you get things like preachers sort of extolling the virtues of the Confederacy in public addresses, and there's no one really to kind of say the other side. And then you have groups like the Daughters of the Confederacy who are responsible for a significant number of the monuments that are in contention today. Uh, they're putting up all these monuments, so it's kind of normalizing this concept of uh, equating the Confederacy and the Federal Army together.
I thought that the monuments came quite a bit later.
They start
Um,
pretty quick. Like the
and
monuments are
they're made even after,
within a couple
like, a few
decades they're
decades
coming
after
up,
the war. Yeah.
and there's like some of the chief of early opponents of this are figures like Frederick Douglass who speak out on the issue, and it does not pick up nearly the same amount of traction that abolition did. Um, that abolitionism did during the Civil War and kind of prior to it.
Was there were some of these, I remember when I was in undergrad and I had a very, very good American history teacher who specialized in the South and African American history. And it was his view that the Southern elite was not punished strongly enough, that the South wasn't actually, they weren't punished strongly enough, and this gave rise to um, various policies that would come later, like Jim Crow and segregation and things like this. You have very much in Mississippi um, the same sort of attitude up until you know the late 60s or 70s. You have that very much protect, like, um, that we're the vanguards of Southern culture. We're protecting our culture, our race, and all this other stuff. And as far as I know, even their own, like in their official government buildings, they would have the Mississippi flag, the Confederate flag, and then the American. I don't know. I heard this somewhere, but I don't know how true it was.
I'm not sure about the flag thing, but
Yeah.
what ends up happening is Reconstruction was probably not going to be a significantly detrimental thing to the South under Lincoln. Lincoln did not appear to have a significant appetite for punishing the South. Um,
Yeah.
it definitely wasn't going to be a priority to punish the South for Johnson. So what happens is there isn't really a punishment. There isn't really a movement that uh, says this is wrong, and there was definitely Republican sentiment at the time uh, for the Reconstruction to be a punishment. Uh,
So there wasn't like a whole denazification of the South. And when I say that, I don't mean it in a literal sense, but like a whole,
right.
yeah,
So,
deconfederation,
so
maybe
like
would be the right term.
they have by about 1875 very successfully in the South ended Reconstruction and kept the antebellum social order intact. They have largely suppressed and returned the Democrats to power. They've largely suppressed the nascent African American movement for political power.
And they also economically restricted um, the African American population. I think with the sharecropping system, as far as I know.
Yes. So this entire they've got themselves where they want to be, and Jim Crow laws come about, and they very much cement these things. Um, and Plessy versus Ferguson comes along and cements this separate but equal system of segregation. and so they're able to go along, and they're able to put forth virtually unopposed this view of the Confederacy, um, that doesn't get a lot of serious pushback, and it has engendered for people a very different sense of how the Civil War came to be and what factors led into it. Uh, and it has become welded to a certain sense of anti-authoritarian sentiment that runs in American politics. Um, so you will see Neo-Confederates make arguments like the Constitution allows for succession, which it doesn't. They'll say things like Amendment 10 turns around and gives the states the authority to secede from the Union, and that's not really the case. Like uh, we know because we have very good records of the discussions and debates around the ratification of the Constitution, that even the Southern states joined with the express understanding that entering into this, and even the Anti-Federalists, one of their chief objections in most cases was entering into this as a permanent union, it cannot be undone.
Mhm.
So they come out and they just try to justify secession as not illegal. They try to take those same documents, like Madison sends a letter to Hamilton when New York is debating uh, ratification, and the Anti-Federalists in New York ask for a provision that lets them exit the Union in a number of years if no Bill of Rights is produced. And Madison sends Hamilton a letter in support of that not being a thing, that you adopt the Constitution forever in toto. And they try to say, well, that doesn't mean what you think it means. So they try to push this idea, this understanding of the Constitution that is geared towards themselves to justify the running into that. So, like, because this is what I've been working on for the video essay for a while, um, and I was trying to decide where to start with this, and I'm like, well, we have to start with the Constitution and why states would accept the Constitution. So it's turning into a long essay, by the way. Anyway, uh, then they run in, and you start running, and you have these problems. It's called the sectional crisis of 1848 on to 1860. And that's not, I think, an accurate way of stating it. So, what you have is a series of crises in the decades leading up to the Civil War, where the chief argument is the power of slave states versus the power of free states. And this the Civil War comes about as much because the South started to lose their domination over the federal government than it does anything else. And it comes about because of John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. And not so much that John Brown did the thing, like they had endured things like Nat Turner's slave rebellion before, and they
Yeah.
just tightened their grip and launched down. But people like Thoreau and a lot of figures in the North lionize John Brown, and John Brown is kind of becomes very instrumental in 1859 before he's executed. He kind of gets this opportunity to speak to the nation, and he speaks with a kind of authority. If you read his writings, that you don't see often. Like he's very convinced that God is going to punish America for this the sin of slavery. So they have these particular problems that they have to overcome in constructing the lost cause that kind of function by ignoring all of history. Um,
Correct.
and with this comes this kind of hero worship of Confederate figures. Uh, we get the myth that Grant is a butcher from the lost cause.
Mhm.
We get this myth of this Confederacy or the Union that pushes through, and this will become something we'll see again in a few minutes when we talk about the Wehrmacht. The myth of the Union overwhelming the tactically brilliant Confederacy, and with numbers and industry. And
Numbers and yeah, the industry behind them. You have that
obviously,
same.
we see that
You
that's
have that
not always
same.
how war works.
No, it's not how war works. You have that same issue um, in regard to the Clean Wehrmacht myth. Uh, I have several books written by former Wehrmacht generals. I've read, of course, von Manstein's book, and he really, really doesn't admit any wrongdoing on his part.
Bonstein is
Um,
probably one of the worst, actually, of the
yeah,
German
yeah,
generals for that.
yeah. Very unapologetic. Um, I mean, almost all of them are. Actually, I can't even really think of one that admitted to their crimes.
Well, it's like we were talking about earlier, is what ended up happening when Germany was partitioned. Uh, a whole lot of generals who ended up on the West German side of Germany wanted
They did,
jobs in
yeah.
NATO. And so they had a very significant incentive to say that we're tactically brilliant generals. We were just overwhelmed by overwhelming Soviet industry and numbers.
And also the Lend-Lease as well. They would probably they used that as
Yeah, the
well.
Soviet Union is probably, or Russia is probably less likely to admit the massive impact of Lend-Lease for
They
them.
are absolutely
Uh,
they certainly are. But in regards to the Wehrmacht, that would be something I'm sure they wrote in their memoirs that them being supported, the Soviet army being supported by with Lend-Lease was a reason why they couldn't win. Which actually, I mean, it is true. Um,
Lend-Lease did a
but
lot for the
it was
Soviet Union.
actually at a tactical level where they lost. It wasn't through numbers that the Soviet army beat them. It was tactical blunders, and the fact that their logistics system was far worse than even the Soviets adapted over time with their logistics, and by the end of the war, they had a fairly decent logistics system.
I think the
Um,
number one thing that Lend-Lease helped the Soviet Union with was on-the-ground logistics. They have a great railroad system. They continue to have a great railroad system.
mhm,
What America shipped over to everyone in droves that you don't think about that often is trucks.
yeah,
Uh, just
yeah,
droves and droves of trucks, and this takes the dynamic of logistics from uh, uh, from a very 18th 19th century into the 20th century. Um, because you're pulling things on carts and horses before, and the German army was largely reduced to this, especially towards the end. Uh, and they're able to put supplies on trucks, and this vastly improves their ability. Because like the truth about the Soviet Union wasn't, we tell stories about how they didn't have enough rifles for everybody. That's not really the case. They had plenty of rifles. They just couldn't get them to the right places. And the
yeah.
trucks turns those things
Especially in the
around.
very first, especially in the very first years of the war,
Yes.
they had tremendous difficulties. They also suffered from a lack of decent leadership. The purges affected them very negatively. Some of their best people, and their best theoreticians, of course, Tukhachevsky being one of them, notwithstanding Tukhachevsky is also a war criminal from the Civil War, the Soviet Civil War, or
The
the
Russian Civil
Russian
War.
so-called.
Yes.
But he was one of their most talented figures, if not the most talented figure, and you see the result of that. You also see the result too of you know when you are in a repressive state, there's a tendency not to want to fight for them to keep them in power, and that's why you see so many units breaking, so many of them being surrounded, so many of them surrendering, not knowing actually that when they did surrender, they were going toward their deaths. Um,
Yeah, there was
that's started to find out. That's how they started to find out very quick that the Wehrmacht was not clean at all. It's one of the first genocidal policies of Nazi Germany was actually the mass execution of Soviet prisoners of war, and it starts very early, um, with deliberately starving them, shooting them, sending them to labor camps, and actually the first use of Zyklon B was not against Jews, but it was against a batch of Soviet prisoners of war. That's
well,
the people that they tested it
while
on.
we're on the Eastern Front, uh, because this is I'm going to talk a little bit about Rommel. and Rommel in
Rommel's
specific to this.
Rommel's the
But
sort of
mention
god figure of Wehraboos.
yes,
And
mention for a moment. Talk about the Einsatzgruppen for a little bit,
yeah,
because this will become important in a second.
me
That's
talk about
you, Einsatzgruppen. Yes.
so what the Einsatzgruppen are is they are task force. They're task forces of usually SD. So the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, I think that's how you pronounce it in German, is it's the intelligence arm of the Nazi Party. It's basically the Nazi Party's secret police. So what the Einsatzgruppen are collective units of that. Einsatz, it literally means like a task force.
The
And
literal translation is
um,
Special Action Group.
special action group, yeah. And they have four major teams. Einsatzgruppen A in the north, B in Army Group Center, C in the southern front, so in Ukraine, and D towards the far south, so like Crimea and the Caucasus. And these groups essentially they're very small. They're probably about a regiment in size, but they're tasked with the elimination of racial enemies, so Jews.
It's basically the
Roma.
Holocaust on wheels.
Yeah, they were the
Actually,
perpetrators of the Holocaust by bullets. Them,
quite literally in some
reinforced
cases.
local auxiliary formations. And also, it's not just the SD with the Einsatzgruppen. They also had the secret police of the Wehrmacht, the GFP, is part of these task forces. The Gestapo. Actually, when you get into the intricacies of German state security, it's very complex. There's so many different organs. There's the Kripo, the criminal police that took part in it, the order police. So the Einsatzgruppe is sort of they're these task force gathered from, some of them are gathered from these other groups too, but their task is to eliminate the targets that I had previously mentioned, also political enemies. So immediately when they go into a village, um, they take a census of the population. Everybody has to show up because the purpose of showing up is to get your ID cards. If you're caught without an ID card, you can be shot on the spot or deported to Germany to slave labor.
So
So this process of identifying enemies starts right away in the occupied Soviet Union, particularly in Ukraine, and they identify people who are members of, Komsomol or the various communist organizations. They put the letter K by their name on the various lists that they can compile. And later on, when they organize actions, they're able to arrest these people along with their families usually and kill them. Those who saw the writing on the wall and hid their Komsomol membership or hid their, membership, their association with, the Stalinist regime, whether it be like, an activist on a collective farm or something like this. Those who remained, usually the Germans used a system to sort of denounce people. Anyway, we're getting off topic, but what
I'm about to get back there. Hang on.
yeah.
So the reason I bring up the Einsatzgruppen is obviously they're bad folks.
Yeah.
However, Rommel is often painted as not a Nazi. Obviously, that's categorically untrue because in order to
No,
rise
it's
any significant rank in the Wehrmacht, you have to be a Nazi.
yeah,
The
you have
second
to.
problem is they try to paint him as unaware or uh, unaware of,
Unaware at worst, at best,
or
actively intervening to
somehow complicit.
prevent the Holocaust, which is absolutely untrue.
So
That's
here's
just an
my
absolute
problem
lie.
with Rommel.
Yeah,
Rommel's initial assignment during the invasion of Poland is heading up Hitler's bodyguard.
yeah.
Maybe he knows about the Holocaust. It seems unlikely at this point he doesn't. His
It's
next
then
assignment is a leading a
Matt,
panzer
Matt,
division.
Daedalus. Can I mention something? It's not even seems. It's 100% that he knows it's going
I
on.
absolutely. I'm going through the
Yeah.
evidence now.
Yeah.
Hang on a second. I got to get this taken care of. I'll be right back.
Right. I'm actually going to go on the stream right now. I'm watching on the comment stream. I want to see some more comments. Let's see. Hello, Grammar Kami. Guess it's slightly less worse to be a grammar commie than a grammar Nazi, but still bad nonetheless. What is a Vatnik? So a Vatnik is, in Russian, the term vata means cotton, and I should know, be aware of the origin of it, but essentially these are the neo-tankies, like the very adamant supporters of Putin and Russian nationalism. Yeah, there's a lot of these people, and they're very obnoxious. Who else? Alfion, thank you for the comment. Yeah, it might be awkward to do a live stream of this with the sort of meager following that we have, but I think that it's certainly a topic that needs to be discussed, and I'm hoping that people will watch this over time, and then we'll have more subscribers and be able to do something similar in the future with sort of a little bit, something more organized, better planned. We didn't even have a game plan for this. We just want to talk about the issue of Neo-Confederates, Wehraboos, and Vatniki. If we have any Russian or Ukrainian speakers that are going to tune in, I can admit to you freely, I am not a native speaker of either of these languages. I do have relatives who are, but yeah, I am not a native speaker, so please be gentle. So that goes for you, Grammar Kami, if you are sort of a grammar NKVD, NKVD, or NKVS in Ukrainian. For those watching our stream, I want to know, what do you want to see us cover? We're going to do a nerding out episode soon, and I want to know maybe what you would like to see from us. Last time we did cryptids, we did Star Wars at one point, which ended up being a very long conversation about the Mandalorians, which was all my doing. I really want to avoid in this current episode. What type of nerding? So, I mean, we can run the gauntlet here of all types of nerdy topics. I don't know as much about Warhammer or Warhammer 40K as Daedalus. He tried to get me into it over the years, and I just never could truly get into it. I don't have the patience to paint.
What are you
Talking with the stream,
is it Star Trek?
proposing, asking them asking them what we should talk about for our nerd episode.
Oh,
So
okay. I have to think about that. Sorry about that dog thing.
no
You know.
problem. Okay, so we're back with Rommel. Um, Getting to where you're gonna go with this. Um, there were talks to set up an Einsatz unit in North Africa. That wasn't done, but they did actually, in areas that were under his military control, there were established camps
Yes.
for
So
the African Jewry.
the
So
Holocaust did arrive in North Africa.
it
Uh,
did, and it's probably one of the least known chapters in the Holocaust. It's one of the most least known subtopics of Holocaust studies.
so
Um,
curiously, and it was done in a really weird way. Recently, Call or Company of Heroes came out with their third installment.
mhm.
They have two campaigns. They have the headlining Italian campaign, but they have a more traditional story campaign. The story campaign follows Rommel, which was weird to begin with, but the intermediate cutscenes are from the perspective of a character who is uh, a Libyan Jew in Benghazi. Um, and you would probably be able to better figure out the veracity of any of what they used. I imagine they made up a story for them. And it's kind of weird because on one hand you're following Rommel and what you're doing in the game, and in between this you have this Libyan character waxing poetic about Rommel. So Rommel gets this kind of mythology created around him, and I think it's because he ends up
Can,
committing
I'm
suicide.
not clear. So are is this character poetically talking about the greatness of Rommel, how he didn't persecute them, or is he,
Not that
is
he
there
doesn't persecute them.
yeah,
They talk about the difficulties, like he talks about the difficulties his family is facing back in Benghazi, for example,
yeah,
but he doesn't necessarily attach it to Rommel.
of
Like
course.
the Africa Corps seems to be a separate entity in
Rommel,
this
so
presentation.
Rommel, the thing that people have to understand with the high command of the Wehrmacht in the areas that are under their jurisdiction, under their governments, they are aware, of course, of what is going on. Rarely, when you talk about military commanders like field marshals like Rommel or Manstein or any of these people, rarely are they placing direct orders for this, but they're well aware of it. They're the officers under them are coordinating with and the intelligence arms of the SS, of course, with the SD. They're working in tandem, and then the Wehrmacht also has its own police groups. So they have the Geheime Feldpolizei, the my German's awful, but the secret field police, and then they also have the regular Feldpolizei, the regular field police. They have a very interesting, like almost this medallion that they wear. Really looks stupid, but these are the people who are in every district center, sort of the governance there, and the people
Yes,
who are in charge of keeping order. So Rommel,
there
he
seems to
did have
me.
a lot of leeway. A lot of these people had leeway if they wanted to stop something. And there also is leeway if you read books like by Christopher Browning, Ordinary Men. There wasn't anything really forcing people to commit these killings. They're doing it out of their own ideological motivation. Sometimes they're doing it because of male peer pressure, like this masculinity, this toxic masculinity that exists. Um, Thomas Kuhne, he's a historian. He's the head of the Holocaust Studies program at Clark University in Boston. Very good leading scholar in this. But yeah, I mean, this is being done. People are following this willingly. And also, the Wehrmacht had a lot of ideological indoctrination within it. It was
Yes,
very much a Nazi army. And that is why today, with the Bundeswehr, you have a complete departure from those traditions.
they've kept.
Um,
There's a very alarming thing I noticed when they were doing the ceremonies around the new chancellor. They kept
really,
the Stahlhelm.
yeah.
I can't
There were
imagine,
some of
like,
these
just as
things
an
that have
aside, I
existed.
cannot imagine picking a more iconic symbol of like, it's a very iconic symbol to keep. It's a good helmet design. Obviously, the PSAT American helmet, the PSAT is the same design, but like they kept it for a ceremonial purpose. Is just
Of
kind
course,
of
yeah.
weird to me.
It's not perfect. I mean, the process isn't perfect with the creation of the clean Wehrmacht myths. Because so after the war, you have denazification. You have a very defeated population, and it's very hard to. And this is the case for I have friends whose grandfathers fought in the Soviet army. My grandfather fought in the Pacific campaign, which is a campaign full of atrocities on both sides. And my grandfather was witness to that, perhaps even participant in some of those. So, it's very hard for someone growing up, especially if they have a good relationship with this person. Not everybody does. Notable example, Arnold Schwarzenegger. I really admire him because he's the first person who will say your heroes are losers. And he talks about his father as a loser, as a soldier in the Wehrmacht. And he was wondering if he participated in crimes. A lot of these people came back broken, alcoholics, with guilt over what they did. Um, as far as units are concerned, there are very few units of the Wehrmacht that are clean, that did not take part in war crimes, or genocide or crimes against humanity. So, you know, Wehraboos, I think how they start is, it's a love for German technology, and eventually it becomes they start reading the memoirs of these officers, and they take them at face value. They believe them to be true, and then this is sort of a spiral. It can lead to sort of adoption of neo-Nazi ideologies. Some of these people who do the reenactments and who are,
I
you
don't
know,
even necessarily think I don't even necessarily think it's a problem with reenactment. What I end up seeing a lot is people like they do they're several generations removed in the case of Neo-Confederates, or uh, not so much. Like these are the same people who tend to be Wehraboos too. You see them feeling that there is something to salvage out of all of this.
of
Uh,
course,
they use the word honor a lot. We're honoring
yeah,
our
they use the
ancestors.
word.
They fought with honor. Um, and it's a really messed up conception of honor in my mind because uh, honor is usually used when it's an external thing. It's kind of a manipulator. Your hand is being guided by this external concept of honor being imposed upon you, and you don't get the space to decide what is honorable in your own mind. So it's a very off-putting conception of honor. Um, and they feel like there's something to salvage out of it. Like maybe their cause was less than ideal. Is that's even like the most generous of these people? Maybe their cause is less than ideal, but they did so uh, honorably, and that's just
There's that same sort of attempt to reconcile. Um, well, actually, there's two types. Um, I find, for example, when I write about the Soviet army or Soviet partisans, and when I study them, I do know that this army, I mean, granted, in World War II, you have atrocities. It's not just a blanket statement that you have atrocities committed on almost all sides, but there are degrees, to how widespread that these acts are occurring, and perhaps with the exception of course, the Nazi forces in Imperial Japan, you have the Soviet Union easily is up there with them, with probably close to Imperial Japan in many aspects. But you also have the fact that without their sacrifice and effort, it's very likely that you know Hitler wouldn't have been defeated. Um, so there is that, um, and it's hard to sort of you want to salvage something out of that, but it's I don't really like the idea of kind of salvaging. It's
S-
best to just tell history the way it is rather than trying to create hero myths.
I,
Because I'm going to return to the example, just bear with me here. I'm going to return to the example of even, you know, US soldiers in the Pacific Theater. There were many occasions where, one, in Japanese culture, in their culture, it is, dishonorable to surrender. But those who did, oftentimes, because of the nature of that war, were killed by American soldiers. My grandfather witnessed this.
yes.
He told me it. So, it was one of those things that you have to tell that story. You have to tell the story too of what it's like being on the business end of American and British bombers. Or, for example, to have, there were cases when British soldiers or US soldiers would enter in a German house and steal from them.
So yeah,
Soviet soldiers did that a lot too.
absolutely.
There's even sexual violence committed by Western allies too. So
Yes.
no force is clean, but you can judge by the degree of the extremeness of the ideology, and there's very few things more extreme than the Nazi ones. Even Stalinism, as bad as it is, when you're including basically whole races of people to be exterminated, it's just you know and they would carry this out. So yeah, that's the thing about it, about salvaging honor from the Confederacy. Here's the thing that I you the Confederacy is an army that fought for the institution of slavery. That is the strongest sort of argument against any sort of honor that it has. But when you compare it to the armies of the 20th century, to when warfare becomes more industrialized.
Stop. Stop.
Yeah, go ahead. Maybe I'm
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think we're about to overextend here. Let me refresh this. There are two significant problems with the Confederacy in my mind. The
okay.
Confederacy is composed principally of officers, at least at the beginning, as they start to raise their army. The Confederacy is composed of officers who are trained at West Point, who explicitly are trained and take oaths of service to the United States of America. Uh,
Yeah,
this oath is an oath they violated. Um,
of course.
and not everyone, for instance, not every Virginian like officer goes and joins Lee. Not every uh, I don't. There's no significant cases of that I can think of off the top of my head of a Northerner fighting for uh, a
South.
high-ranking Northerner fighting for the South. So there's the first problem. They commit treason, outright.
Yeah,
The second problem is that the cause that the Confederacy is built around uh, is a horrifyingly racist version of slavery. The chattel slavery system is absolutely horrifically, nightmarishly racist. It justifies itself uh, through, for example, saying that this is a divine will type
of course. Yeah,
situation.
they use scripture to try
Mm.
to justify it.
There's also part of the lost cause, and this is very much reinforced by our history education in high school. The part of the lost cause um, is this deification of the Confederacy and this reification of it as this independence movement. and
Yep.
it's simply not. It's also not a very efficient or effective movement either. Um, the Confederacy becomes increasingly despotic as the war goes on, and that's even in conjunction for what you could expect a government of the time to be. Um, the intelligentsia of the Confederacy talks openly about winning this war and then spreading slavery into Mexico and Cuba, for example,
I
which
mean,
is a bit of a
it
trick
existed
because
prior there.
a
So
bit of a trick because they had a significant amount of trouble getting into Pennsylvania. Uh, Still, this is kind of the way they view the world, and they also start seeing beyond the war almost immediately. Like they have delusions of grandeur, uh, which is shared by their modern day counterparts. They
so
have these
there is a parallel there then with
so
the Nazi regime.
yes, and they see this ready-made
Totally
workforce they can use to industrialize. So they say we can just take slavery and turn it into an industrial occupation. Uh,
which would have made it even
and
it
by
would have
this
made it
time,
it would have turned it into a much worse nightmare than what it was.
yes, by this time, the
Yeah.
importation of new slaves has long been banned. It had a 20-year moratorium before Congress could consider the banning of the importation of new slaves. The only new slaves that are coming in are those being born or from black market trading.
Yep.
So imagine a situation in which the Confederacy is victorious and then turns around, expands slavery, the domestic institution, to Mexico, expands it to Cuba, maybe if they can get across the water.
When they said this was expanding their style of system there, or going in there, going to Mexico and kidnapping like individuals and bringing them
Part of
to
it was that there was people who escaped slavery and went to Mexico. The other part of it is, for example, Lee wasn't terribly enamored of the Mexicans during the Mexican-American War, which was a couple decades earlier.
yeah.
The other component of this is what if they win? Don't they have
Yeah,
nothing to stop them from restarting the capture and importation of uh, people from Africa again, some of whom have fled the United States because you have situations, for example, the Dred Scott decision, which pretty explicitly tells you that you're not going to be treated as a citizen. The Confederacy is much more horrifying than we teach. Um,
yeah.
it's not your quirky Second American War of Independence. It's very, very reactionary. They like this concept of like another thing that gets brought up a lot is states' rights being a cause of the Civil War, and there's some snarkiness about the states' rights to what, but really they were pretty much done with the concept of states' rights at that point. They were just it was over. It was time to go ahead and move on to we're going to build a strong central government because there's no significant threat to our conception of central government anymore.
I'd really like to read. I know that they've been written some social histories of slavery and the plantation system and all of that. I did listen to some recordings of former slaves, which was
Yes.
interesting.
I think the
And
best
one of the interesting things that they mentioned, I mean, this has no real, it's not exactly pertinent, but they mentioned actually when the Union soldiers came in and robbed the place, and some of like they said it actually with kind of they were seemed to be quite alienated by their liberators, by some of the Union soldiers that
that
they saw, which was interesting to me.
there
Not like that it's not like that they were upset about, but they saw me like, just marauding people who were stealing, and you know I'm sure not every
that
Union
certainly
soldier
happens.
ideologically, pro-abolitionist or really thinking about this all that much.
So abolitionism never really gains a whole lot of traction in the North until the Civil War. Um,
Hmm.
the kind of thing to counterbalance this, I think, is to talk about the fact that for the most part, we don't really get away from white supremacy anywhere in the country in this period of time. So you have a lot of people who are anti-slavery in that they are opposed to the increasing power of the southern states in the federal government. And they want to contain or block that. So you get things like the Missouri Compromise in 1820, or you get the outright uh, denial of the Fugitive Slave Act in the 1850s, where states just work very hard to get around that. Um, you don't really see a huge amount of sympathy for the concept of abolitionism. I saw one estimate recently that it never really got to beyond 15% of the population. But then you do get this. You get a couple things that happen. Um, you see the first real nativist party in American history emerge. Uh,
After the Civil War.
no, before the Civil War, the Know Nothings. Uh, there, there's a lot of back and forth that happens between the Know Nothings, the Whigs, and the Republicans prior to the election of 1860. Um, and the Republicans eventually come out on top. But like the Know Nothings are A, horribly nativist and horribly racist, and B, um, more so than the Whigs, who aren't terribly helpful for African Americans either. And the other thing you see come up a whole lot, two things happen. The first, and I don't think Abraham Lincoln gets elected if John Brown doesn't do his raid on Harper's Ferry and get executed, and everyone gets a little sad about that in the North. Um, so John Brown is executed, and the South is horrified, especially in Virginia where it occurred. They're absolutely horrified by the sympathy that he engendered. Uh, the next thing that happens is Abraham Lincoln gets elected, and like it's not, I don't think, accurate to say that the vote gets split in any kind of detrimental way for his opponents. But you see four candidates get electoral votes, but Abraham Lincoln wins in a landslide, absolute majority in the electoral college. And I don't think that happens if John Brown hasn't greased the treads for him.
Yeah.
Uh, so the
The
South kind
Civil
of
War
flips out.
seems like a conflict that was. It seemed like a conflict that was going to happen because of the economics involved, because of the politics involved. So I don't see any sort of, like alternative scenario. I think it would have happened even if Lincoln didn't get elected eventually.
There was a lot between.
Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm
There
wrong.
was a lot of kicking the can down the road for the Civil War.
Yeah.
So the Constitution kicks the can down the road hard. You have a couple things that immediately, the Constitution kind of sets the stage. So the first thing that there's a couple things that screw us into the Civil War and the Constitution. The first is the Three-Fifths Compromise. The Three-Fifths Compromise gives a fairly significant population bonus to power kind of thing for electoral politics, both because the House of Representatives is population based and the electoral college is population based. So you have a lot of roads to the presidency go through the South now. And like the first couple presidents, I think the first 7 are from Virginia.
Yeah.
It's maybe that there might be it's called the Virginia Dynasty. I forget the exact order. At any rate, you have a whole lot of roads to the presidency that go through the South, and not nearly as many that go through the North. And for the South at that time, to them, because this is before the cotton gin is invented, and before cotton becomes profitable, and you see this economic explosion in the South, they see themselves as the weaker partners in the Union. That will absolutely set them off, Bluestone. I approve. That they actually consider themselves a weaker part. But then the cotton gin comes, and cotton becomes very profitable, and slavery explodes that 3/5 portion of the population, and they grow bigger populations and more economic power. So all of a sudden, where they were somewhat disadvantaged and had a little leg up, that leg up becomes much bigger. So you see all throughout the 1800s, pretty significant Southern control of the federal government. And 1860 comes around and Lincoln wins the election, and all of a sudden they don't They don't feel like they're in control anymore. So the absolute first sign that they might be in trouble, they bolt. Um, but even all the significant landmark years along the way, like 1820 comes along, the Missouri Compromise, and a fair number of the founding fathers are still alive at this point. So we have them corresponding over the Missouri Compromise and the debate about it. And like Thomas Jefferson explicitly writes a letter where he says, if they don't pull this off, the Union might break up. Um, Andrew Jackson comes to power as president, and he's really the first populist president in American history. Uh, and he's a Southern plantation owner. He pushes a lot of very pro-Southern policies, particularly towards Native Americans and the enslavement of African African people. And he expands these powers because there's a significant intertwining of history for people who escaped enslavement who ran away to Native American communities. S-
May I bring something up? And I think it's something that naturally one who is interested in both these topics would, or knows a little bit about both these topics would want to explore. Um, Nazi Germany envisioned uh, Ukraine specifically as sort of one giant plantation. Uh, their goal was actually to destroy all of the major cities in uh, in Russia, quote unquote. They used a lot of times they would use the term Russia. They never really referred to all the time to Ukrainians, especially like in the middle of the country and in the east, as like Ukrainians. Their conception was mostly the Ukrainians that lived in the Austria-Hungarian Empire. Um, but the idea was to destroy these major cities and sort of remake the infrastructure to that of a sort of a plantation slave state. And hearing what I hear from you about sort of some of the Southern intellectuals, their ideas of winning and having an expansion or continuation of what they were already doing, to utilize slaves to industrialize the South. It kind of I see parallels in sort of this utopianism, and it's an exclusive. The thing that they have in common is it's an exclusive utopianism. It's a utopianism only
the
for
utopia
those
of dystopia.
racially fit. Yeah.
So I think I wouldn't go so far as to like some people have tried to claim that Confederates are proto-fascists, and I don't think that's really the case.
No,
Uh,
I don't think so either. And I also don't, I still stand by what I said, that, in terms of gradations, when looking at the Confederacy versus an army like the Wehrmacht, um, you see a lot more. I mean, it has to do not just with ideology though, but the changes that take place in those decades in war, and also sort of killing, and also you have expansion of racist ideology and various things that lead to what we see in the 20th century. But in
there's a
any case, I still stand by what I say, that when you do compare them, you know there's a little bit of a degree of difference, but I'm not saying that
there's a common intellectual thread
there's a
follows
thread. Yeah,
that
for
follows
sure.
along from scientific racism into and the scientific racism is not an American invention. We swallowed it wholeheartedly, but it's not an
Yeah,
American invention. And there's
we
this
contributed to it though, as well, to
yes,
the development, for sure.
we definitely got the middle part with eugenics. So you
Yeah,
see a thread from scientific racism to this justification of chattel slavery to the Confederacy, through on to the eugenics movement, through like the gold standard
yeah.
movement, through to the Nazis, and coming on into today. And you originally asked me at the start, and I didn't really get into it. I apologize about what kind of difference or how this affects modern politics.
Yeah.
Uh, I don't necessarily think I buy the this is the most divided the country's ever been. because prior to the
Oh,
Civil War,
I don't believe it either. I don't know if I suggested
no,
that,
you
but
didn't. I'm
yeah,
just trying to set the stage. So prior
yeah.
to the Civil War, you get Bleeding Kansas, where you have open fighting about trying to establish the sectional conflict before to get Kansas as a slave or a non-slave state. Uh,
Something that must be mentioned too is Bleeding Kansas extends into the Civil War in
oh
some
yeah, it
of
just
the,
picks up.
yeah, as far as the brutality of it in terms of non-combatants being affected by it, that's where you see the worst in, I think, in that degree. I don't know for sure, I haven't read a lot of
Georgia will try
social
to lay
history.
claim to Sherman being the absolute worst, but I'm not sure that's true either. Uh,
I'm not sure either.
uh,
I want to find a book that is on, you know, Civil War atrocity, or like sort of this total warfare within the Civil War. I haven't found that yet. I haven't. I mean, I don't know the historiography of the American Civil War that well, but given the distance, of time since then, it's a much more developed historiography. The more time you get, and especially if it's a subject that's well studied, and it's still a subject that is provokes interest and instills interest in people today, um, the more distance you have, the more you're able to usually understand it. And I think one reason why these revisionist movements happen, they start early. They don't really start, you don't see a revisionist movement far from the event. You see it
pretty
maybe within
quick,
a few decades. What?
pretty quick usually.
Yeah.
If you're going to launder
So,
your reputation, you better start now. That's really what the lesson you take from that. Uh,
yeah. But
but
yeah, go
you
ahead.
you asked if there's been an increase for Neo-Confederate sympathies in the recent years since 2016. I don't know that there has been an increase of it. Um, not at least explicitly since 2016, and I would have to look at the numbers since 2020. What the Southern Poverty Law Center has noted is that they see an uptick in participation in militia movements and far-right extremist groups anytime a Democrat gets elected. Uh,
Yeah.
and that happened in droves, particularly when Barack Obama got elected, because guess what? First African American president. Um, if there is an increase to be had, it's probably from that. There was a very high watermark for far right movements in the United States. And they have a very complicated relationship with how they operate. But the high watermark for them was uh, the Charlottesville rally, which was explicitly about, or it started over a Confederate statue. Um,
It did. Yeah.
and then someone got run over, and it was a horrible thing. And there was also a considerable amount of clashes between the far right and everyone else. Um, and they haven't been able to gather like that since. Like they had this
I
big
want to
party,
I
and
want to mention something. Um, and I have the same view in regards to Ukraine's decommunization decommunization policies. I almost view that, monuments should be, instead of removed, they still have value historically. Um, they don't belong necessarily in public spaces, but I believe that a museum
yeah, I would
should,
generally agree.
yeah,
Because a museum with a trained historian as the keeper is going to be able to put things in context.
of course.
That's
It is
kind.
gonna, I don't think it's gonna completely avoid, you can't prevent revisionism from coming up. Because say for with decommunization, you have the issue where there's proponents of it fully that want to remove every monument to Soviet soldiers in Ukraine, and you have 5.4 million Ukrainians who served in the Soviet army for various reasons. Some were forced to, some were mobilized right after their villages were liberated and sent without any training into the Dnipro. So I mean, things like that happen, but even so, I know people there who these are their grandparents. They remember them very fondly. They know too. They're proud of the fact that their grandfather or whoever this person is was responsible for the toppling of Nazi Germany. They're not necessarily thinking of did my grandfather when he went into Berlin take part in any of the atrocities there. They're just but in any case, it's still a very complex issue.
There is.
That's the thing. And the one thing I do want to bring up is how you have a lot of like Americans who like sons, daughters of the revolution, a lot of people who their family's been here a long time, and they have in their history people who fought in the Confederacy. Obviously, there's such a distance now. You don't have a lot of irregular Southerners who had a relative who fought in the Confederate Army who are thinking, yeah, let's bring slavery back. They fought for the right cause. They're not really necessarily thinking of that, but you do have people who do. You do have people who do think that way. And in Russia, there's people who think that way. Let's go to Berlin again and commit atrocities.
There
I mean,
are.
there are people who think that way. In Germany, remarkably, such people exist, but it's very small and it's very dangerous for them, as far as their reputation, their their marketability to come out with sort of these feelings about the Wehrmacht or Nazi Germany. I mean, the symbols are banned.
I think Germany has probably done as good a job as you can expect in a liberal society of
They have, yeah,
of trying to work around this problem.
they've done good. The
There
one
are
thing that, yeah,
so I'm going to sort of draw a set of parallels here. There are degrees to which someone is going to occupy this kind of ethnic essentialism and try to like think that they should return to a state of slavery or is kind of a really extreme case. But you
yeah,
see a
it is.
whole lot of people who are white supremacists and they feel like there is some kind of conception of whiteness that has to be protected. And that's very common. But even then, you see a whole host of people who are not necessarily uh, white supremacists in view engage with ideas that are a product of white supremacism. Um, one of the things I was thinking of because I made a crack about Sabaton the other day. I made it today. It's been a long week again, guys. I'm not sure what day it is or what I've been doing things on. Anyway,
Sabaton's a very fun band, but you have to understand that everything that they do, I mean, I don't think they're really thinking that way. I think that they kind of,
I
they're
I I
coming
don't
from
think they put
they're,
nearly enough thought
they're
into
not
their
coming
work.
from it. They're not coming from it as a historian when they write these songs.
No,
It's kind of all tongue in cheek, really.
but
Like,
I made the crack that their History Channel Ancient Aliens bad. Um,
I mean,
The
yeah, they
concept,
are.
though, the very concept of engaging with that idea of ancient aliens is inherently kind of racist because you see these people arguing that all of these things, with maybe the possible exception of Stonehenge, all of these great monuments that were built by people who aren't white had to be assisted in some way. And that's simply not the
There are
case.
people there's still people who believe Stonehenge was invented was
Yes, there are, but
made.
they're a lot less common. Uh,
Yeah, sure,
eh,
of course, yeah.
but you
Or
see these people
people who believe that the Druids used magic to to levitate these stones.
yes, or we saw in the What If Altist video this weird conception of civilization that extends way beyond the definition or boundaries that anyone would consider practicable, and that they have these ideas and they engage with them, and not necessarily meaningly in a meaningful way, but sort of just as like, haha, what we're doing, that just aren't uh aren't copacetic, and like this ancient alien type thing or Atlantis or any of the crazy conspiracy
Atlantis
theories.
is so many of these myths that get popular in the 19th century are really popular with the SS and the Nazi
Yes,
Party.
the Germans, the Nazis picked these things up and
Really
run
into
with them.
supernaturalism. They believe, for example, the witch hunts in Europe were a targeting of, this Aryan witch cult, like a pagan heritage that, The one thing that is not emphasized a lot, and I think like historians or so-called historians like Richard Carrier, who are really they're really looking to every historian is looking to validate their point, but he overlooks so much of the anti-Christian nature of the not most of a lot of the Nazi leadership, the most prominent
Oh,
ones.
Himmler was absolutely working to set up a little pagan cult thing.
Of course,
Uh, there's the other thing, like
Rosenberg too was very adamant into this.
Himmler picks up the Atlantis
Neo-Paganism.
thing and just goes with it. He's like, yeah,
Hitler,
Himmler,
when
not
you read
Hitler.
his, yeah,
As I
Himmler
understand
for
it, Himmler was uh, going around the bend on the Atlantis business.
Hitler, the very anyone who wants to know about the workings of his mind, I recommend it's the transcriptions of the meetings of him and Bormann. It's called Hitler's Table Talk. It was translated, I think, by Gerhard Weinberg. I'm not sure who did it, but essentially you get an idea of the inner workings of his mind and his politics and the way that I see Hitler, although he's an architect of a lot of these policies and he's the arbiter of this, he is the prime mover in many ways, not in all ways. There's a lot more complexities to it, but he's a very, more than anything, a cunning manipulator and politician. And I'm not so sure. Of course, he believes a lot of what what he says, but the neo-paganism, the
I
things
would
like that
hazard
that
that
didn't yeah,
Hitler
that
has a
didn't really matter
very
too much.
sincere hatred of uh, the people he considers undesirable, but he doesn't necessarily buy into the rest of it. Like he's perfectly
No.
willing to sell neo-paganism if it gets him dead
Yeah.
people he doesn't like.
He's also on the same end politically maneuvering to win over Christians in Germany at times. But privately, he is talking about eventually wanting to persecute the church, both the Protestant and Catholic Church in Germany, to remove them entirely because they are a threat to him.
Yes.
And that's the thing. You do have people like Richard Harrier who want to demonize Christianity so much that they believe that Nazism is an offshoot. You know that you can actually for like $400 book him for a debate, and my friend, a good friend of mine's like, you should have debate him on this, and I think I could eviscerate Richard Harrier or Carrier on this because there's just so much evidence against him.
We
I
do
mean,
not we do not currently possess the budget of to book people for debates in that price
I'm not going
range.
to debunk, but we thought about doing it actually at the Parkview Church, like the big mega churches around here, and it's funny because well, I am Christian, but it's I'm not like very very religious. I'm not like like a fervent person, and like but I would do that just for the attempt to do that because one, he's a womanizer. I do know that for a fact from people who've gone to these atheist conventions, and two, he's absolutely wrong.
Uh
That's
yeah. So probably I want to tie this all back into Russia and Ukraine a little bit. I have noticed that
he
there
gets
is
to Russia. Can I have something that I want to bring up about this and how it relates to it?
sure.
Russia, the independent Russian army and state, as we know it, hasn't been around long enough to sort of develop, and it hasn't gotten its, quite, pardon my French, ass kicked hard enough to really, have a lost cause myth. That you have sort of like in the Vatnik movement, you have I mean, a sick, you know, not in like sort of a healthy way, but like a very sick honoring of of like a sick interpretation of World War II, of like of it being current day manipulation of it, of the Soviet victory, of Soviet heroism and all of that. You have a lot of twisting of it, but I don't really see like I see people like a lot of people online saying Russia is the modern army for Western civilization, for the European race, things like this, that they're protecting it. And it's absolutely ridiculous because, in Russia itself and within the Russian army, you have disproportionately a high number of people who are not Europeans, who are not even, they're not ethnic Russians. And, Russians taught this sort of Slavic supremacy, were the leader of all the Slavs, yet their society is certainly not homogenous, and much less so actually than places that they're attacking, like Ukraine, or threaten to attack, like Poland. That's a whole different issue, but you know, I that's the argument that I see with a lot of these right wingers, like that Russia is protecting traditional values, European values, real European values. The you know, and it's just it's I mean, it's not exactly true.
So I have
Um,
noticed as I've been interacting with these figures, I have noticed this trifecta of Neo-Confederate, Wehraboos, Vatnik, and like they're very hostile towards people who display support for Ukraine. Um, they're
and in my end, I witness a lot of, not so much now because Ukrainians are busy fighting a war, so they're not really thinking about these topics as much. But I did notice in Ukrainian nationalist circles at the very least, at very best, a sympathy for the Wehrmacht, and at worst, like a complete revisionist view where they're saying, there's a saying that they have: if Hitler had won, we'd be drinking Bavarian beer in Ukraine now.
not so much. No.
Oh, no, no. The truth of it is that you'd be gone. There wouldn't be this debate. And the ironic thing is, I mentioned this to a lot of these people, and they just can't seem to understand that. And it's because of having suffered under both systems. The Soviet system in Ukraine, I'm not going to get into a diatribe on this, but in large part, not in 100%, but it a lot of its terror apparatus functioned, as a result of the people living in the Ukrainian SSSR, and a lot of them were ethnic Ukrainians. Perhaps actually by a certain time, by the 1939, the majority.
Yeah,
So
part of the particular problem I think is there's a very downstream effect you have. If you start to accept one set of bad history, you're going to arrive at another, and
yeah,
that's going to color how you are looking at the present.
of
So you
course,
have this set of circumstances where you have a group of people who are nominally opposed to their country's aims. Like you have that Scott Ritter type who just sort of sit there and
yeah.
talk out of their asses, frankly. Um, but you then you get this particular set of people who feel um, aggrieved by the United States and aggrieved by the United States support of Ukraine and aggrieved by this concept of people pushing back against their nonsense history. Um, and it sort of snowballs into this problem, into this trifecta. I think the key takeaway I would put to
Where I
people.
can't, that said, where I can't wrap my when the thing that I can't wrap my head around is this trifecta. I don't think these people realize, like, when they're Vatniks, are they like tanky Vatniks where they're talking about Soviet soldiers, or like maybe
I don't think
the
so.
Russian Liberation Army, the Vlasovsky,
I think these are the everything
artillery.
I don't like is communism people. Um, uh,
Well, if they're a Vatnik, they're basically, there's two opposing things here that don't match: the Wehraboo ideology, and then with Vatnik ideology, part of it at least, with the Soviet
don't
army
don't
with their
don't try
diametrically,
to reconcile these things.
you
It'll
can't.
it'll
Yeah,
it'll
the
truly drive
stupidity.
you insane.
Yeah, the stupidity is
If you become capable of reconciling those things, then we have a nice little room for you.
I think I should get like a Nobel Peace Prize or some sort of reward.
That's not what's going to happen.
Oh, I get what you mean. Yeah, the
A very
yeah,
happy little
structural room with
room.
white walls and padding. I get it.
Yes.
No,
Uh,
you're for
but
sure.
so I think kind of the takeaway, and one of the things that we decided to do this about, like we have escaped from the original view of this project. I think not just this episode, but this entire project was intended to be something else before we started, and we've gotten to here, and I'm not unhappy with that, but like there has to be the discussion has to happen not just among historians. It has to happen now in the public.
It does, yeah.
um, which is why we're doing this. And we'd appreciate it if you subscribe so more people could see we could do this. Um,
Absolutely. And I think we're gonna call it a night. This
yes,
has been a great talk. Um, like, hit our subscribe button, ring the bell. Do we have a bell?
we do. Everyone has a bell. The other thing I'm
Ring
going to
our
bring
bell.
up is we have a couple things coming up. I have to talk with Touchgrass and you about finishing the What If Altist thing, and we're probably going to make a meal out of What If Altist regularly because I think he's going to be my meal ticket. Um, Secondly, we have another interview coming out with the professional. I did the interview today. I got to sit down and edit the interview because it involved mental health talks. We decided not to do it live, just to make sure that we can keep everything copacetic on the end of HIPAA. The next thing is we are going to try to do better because we kind of fell on our ass in March. We're going to try to
Yeah.
do better on A, knowing what we're doing ahead of time, and B,
Mhm.
advertising it, and C, doing it on time. Um,
Absolutely.
and I am going to start doing individual streams again, not this week because I got stuff going on, but the week after this.
All
So,
right.
um, if you have suggestions, President Sunday has graciously said you can tag me in the Cathedral Discord server, or you can join our Discord server where we have a stream suggestion thing. If there's anything you want me to look at, or you want Hetman to look at, tag either one of us so we
Also,
can.
I went to a bookstore today and picked up a very relevant one to the topic. It's Inside Hitler's High Command by Geoffrey. I don't know how to say his name, Magargi or something. Um, I did meet Geoffrey when I did a seminar at the U.S. Memorial Holocaust Museum, and he's one of the experts on the Wehrmacht and the Holocaust and sort of the Wehrmacht leadership in general. He's one of the foremost scholars of it, and this is about. I guess in this book I haven't read it yet, but his argument is that it wasn't Hitler that lost the Wehrmacht the war, but the Wehrmacht that
That's
the
fair.
war.
And
So,
finally, the second part of the Political Violence in America essay series was entirely written, and then I hated all of it and I started rewriting it. So we are proceeding apace on that. I know I say that every week, but we are proceeding apace on that, and I hope to start recording by the end of this coming week. So with that, I'm going to close out the stream, and I want to wish you all a
mhm,
very lovely evening.
mhm.